Tell me about all the different jobs you had, what you wanted to be when you grew up, and how that panned out.
Well, I wanted to teach. I wanted to teach poetry and literature, the things that I majored in school. First, I wanted to be an astronaut, but that didn't work out, having no aptitude in science or math. But anyhow, I wanted to teach. I found out that I had a great aptitude for writing and understanding literature and understanding English Romantic literature. And, when I went to grad school, I made the dean's list. My last 2 years of regular college and both years of my master's degree made the dean's list. Loved what I was doing, wanted to teach it. Problem was, and Zadie would always say to me, well, what are you going to do with a major in literature? Open a bookstore? He said, open a literature store, was what he said. So I thought I was going to be a teacher, and I knew I was going to be a great teacher. But it was at a time where, teachers, literature teachers and history teachers were a dime a dozen. At that time, the way the country was going and everything else, and the war movement and all that. And so I finally, as I said before, I landed a part-time job at Anne Arundel Community College. As the semester was supposed to start, they had a low enrollment. I didn't get the job, just was shut out like 2 weeks before I was going to start. I had all my lesson plans done. I knew what I was going to do. So anyway, I had to get a job, and I went out just looking for any job, which was going to be at the time just going to be the temporary job that until I found the big teaching job. Um, and I applied everywhere. Mom will make jokes about this. I even applied to be an exterminator, even though I pick up bugs in cups and throw them out of the house. But I applied to be an exterminator because they got a company car. But anyhow, I finally got I got a job with Keebler Cookie Company. I had to go through a whole process to go work with the boss and show him what I could do and all this kind of stuff. And I found out, which this really shocked me because sales was the last thing I ever had in my mind. But again, I got $8,500 a year and a company car, which was a tiny Ford Pinto, no air conditioning, roll up windows, taxi cab orange. But I had a company car, so it was one less car we had to buy. And it turned out, somehow or another, I was really good at it. I had a way of talking to the managers of the grocery stores, and I was selling Keebler cookie displays where it used to only be Nabisco displays. And then I had to go out at night and do resets, midnight resets at different stores where you had to, set the plan up in the cookie aisle. And where Nabisco used to always steal all the space, I wouldn't put up with it. And I would just say, I know you're number one, but we're a close number two, and we need more space. And that was a big deal. I started to get a pretty good reputation. I was selling displays, my numbers were good, and finally I started to realize I can do this. I'm pretty good at this, and I was going to start looking somewhere else. And it's funny because my boss's boss, who I hardly knew at all, called me one day and asked me to meet him for breakfast. And I met him for breakfast, and I was scared to death. I thought I was getting fired, and I couldn't think of a reason, but and he wanted to promote me. He told me, and I was given no hint at all that this was coming. He wanted me to manage the Safeway account, and to not be on the street anymore, but to manage the Safeway account and make sure all their stores were in order, that we got our share of shelf space, and that I sold them on our promotions at their headquarters. And every month go in and tell them what we had on promotion and this and that and the other. And it was like a big move. For me, it was huge. Salary wise, it was a big move, even though nowadays we would laugh at it, but back then it was a big deal. And so, I was at a whole new level, and I was told that the buyer at Safeway was a ball buster woman, and I would never be able to sell her anything. And, she was a ball buster, but I was able to somehow sell her stuff. And I think it was because, and this is like first lesson, I guess. And it sounds kind of hokey, but as a salesperson, I made up my mind I was always going to be honest. I was never going to bullshit a customer about how good something was, how bad something was, what the real story was behind this or whatever. I was 100% honest in every way I could. And so with her, it was the same thing. You know, we would have some stuff that was on promotion, and I would say, look, you'd be better off buying this or whatever. So, you know, she didn't love me, but she bought a lot from me, and that really went well. But even with that, I realized I'm good at this, and I could be making more money and work towards a higher level. And so, you know, I went to a employment agency, and I ended up getting a job with Anderson Clayton Foods, which was 7C salad dressing and chiffon margarine. And I remember my boss at the time from Keebler, he worked out of the office in Virginia. And I wanted to go over and tell him, he was one that, even though I wanted to get a higher level, just wouldn't do it. And so I wanted to just tell him in person that I was leaving. I drove all the way out there like a dummy. I didn't call first. He was in Baltimore. So I found out what hotel he was at, and I went and I called from the lobby, and he said, what do you want? What are you doing here? I said, I just need to talk to you. So he let me come up to his room, and I told him that I was going to this job, and the job involved managing food brokers, which I had never done, but I knew what it involved. He said, you're gonna hate that job and you won't be any good at it. Just like that, he said that. You were gonna hate that job and you'll never be any good at it. And first of all, that's all he had to say to me, because again, with the whole sports thing and all, I was pretty competitive. And by that time, I was feeling pretty cocky, knowing that I was pretty good. And I said, well, you know, I think I'm gonna be good at it. I know what I have to do. And I know I'm not getting anywhere further with Keebler. And, you know, I enjoyed the 2.5, 3 years, whatever it was. But, you know, I'm ready to move on. So, you know, I left. And with Anderson Clayton Foods, you know, I learned how to work with brokers. And the funny thing was, with brokers, it's harder to sell if your product isn't a great product. And we were like Keebler was with Nabisco, 7C salad dressing versus Kraft salad dressing. And then what was the other one? Wishbone. We were like number 3. So we weren't very important. And chiffon margarine, the same thing. We weren't very important to the broker. So I struggled with that for a couple years. And they were good people. I got to go on my first plane flight anywhere to Dallas, to their headquarters, to sales meetings for the first time, big sales meetings and stuff like that. I learned a ton of stuff, but I also learned that there was more out there and that I was never going to make it with a company that was in 3rd place at the brokers. So I actually got a call. We were in Ocean City, and I got a call from a headhunter that said they had a company that was interested in me. It turned out it was Hubline, and I didn't know what Hubline was. And he said, well, it's A1 steak sauce, boing, and Grey Poupon mustard, and Ortega Mexican foods, things that were #1 in their categories. And they just, you know, now I don't know if this was bullshit from the recruiter, but he said they had heard about you and through the industry and everything, and they want to talk to you. And I talked to them, and I got that job, and it was a whole different world. I walked into a broker, and it was like the red carpet was rolled out. The guy from A1 is here. And they knew we were #1 in their house. They were making a fortune off of A1, and we had to build Grey Poupon, and we had to build Ortega, but they were fairly easy builds on the East Coast too. Mexican food was just starting to take root. So I was knocking my numbers dead, and then I won that big sales contest where we won a trip to Spain, and I was also becoming a little bit of a spokesperson for other sales managers that wanted to know how to do things, and marketing would ask me, well, what do you think? And we'd have sales meetings, and I would contribute and say, we need to try this and try that. And that's when I got called at the airport, getting ready to interview for another job. But that's also what finally got them to come to me and say, we want you, we're developing this new position. You're good between marketing and sales, they all respect you. We want you to come and do this position, and that's when they brought me in. And at that time, I was a totally 100% trusting person. I believed that, you know, if you were working for people, it was like family and this and that and the other. So all through my career up until then, that's how I felt, and I was very good at what I did and kept being good at what I did. And then they got bought out. And when I ended up with Paul Lamonia, he finally got that job, came through with McCormick and Company. And we came in, and that's where I changed in a bad way for a while and started to realize some other things. I changed in a bad way because he brought another guy in from McCormick too, and to McCormick, and the McCormick Food Service division had been run like a junk company. It was horrible. You walked in and you could just tell they didn't know what the hell they were doing, but Paul was a very cocky, arrogant guy, as was the other guy, and we were going to change McCormick and Company, which he had all the great ideas. We were going to do it, and I was going to be the liaison between sales and marketing and all that. The problem was we became three cocky guys, and I was one too. We were going to change McCormick. Well, they had guys that had been there for 100 years under the stodgy McCormick way of doing things, and they were fighting it tooth and nail, almost like Mickey's going through now, fighting it tooth and nail. And we just got more and more cocky, and this is the way we're going to do things, and da 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 da. And it worked for a good while. I mean, we did change the whole face of that place, and we improved their technology, improved the level of salespeople, improved sales, changed their entire packaging, their marketing. We did what we were supposed to do, but built a lot of resentment while we were doing it. And so eventually, Paul got fired. This was after, I don't know, probably 7 or 8 years that I worked for him. He got fired, and they started bringing other people in, but they always brought in people from other divisions to be our general manager. Nobody got promoted from our division. We were considered the black sheep of McCormick. And so Paul got fired, and they brought somebody new in, and I was still doing great. I changed their entire customer service. Paul had asked me to do this. He said, we need a better customer service organization. Can you do this as well as what you're doing? Totally rebuilt their customer service department, and built up their confidence by having national, customer service week, bringing them all pizzas and making them feel really good about what customer service meant. And so I was doing a really good job for them. And even to the end, I wasn't in any danger. One time, one of the old guys complained to the new general manager, and the new general manager called me in and we talked, and I told him, this is what he's complaining about, and this is what I'm doing. You can decide, but I think what I was telling him needed to be done. Needed to be done. And the guy kept me on because he was letting a lot of people go. But anyhow, at the end, I was just marching along at what I thought was a pretty good way. Now, I will admit that I was pushing them for more responsibility. I just was, I had been there 16 years. I wanted more, and my compadres were all getting made vice presidents, and I was director of marketing. And I thought if I took more responsibility, I'd be a vice president too. I didn't find out till later that they had a policy. They didn't make marketing vice presidents because they didn't believe in marketing. But anyhow, so I was pushing for more responsibility, whatever. I don't think I was too big of a pain in the ass, but apparently I was to some people. But again, as you know, 2 days before my 50th birthday, a guy who the new general manager was a friend of mine that we came up together through McCormick. Now, he started at the very bottom. He started working in their spice plant. had worked his way up, has gotten his MBA and everything like that, but still a very nice guy. And the next thing I know, I was called into his office and I was fired. To me, it was out of nowhere. If there was stuff going on in the background, I didn't know about it, but I was like stunned. And that's when I started to think, you can't trust people, because I had actually helped him save his job. He had told me one day he was going to leave. He hated the general manager at the time. He said, Arnie, I'm putting my resume out there. And I told him, be calm down. They change general managers here every year to a year and a half. Just let it pass, which he did. And then he eventually moved up to be a general manager. So I could speculate as to what happened. It could have been I turned 50 years old and I was getting into that level of a higher pension, because they had pensions at that time, or I was Jewish, and McCormick was I was told coming in that they wouldn't ever promote a Jewish person, but I got promoted like 6 times when I was there over 16 years. But anyhow, suddenly at 50 years old, I was out on the street without having a clue why, just totally befuddled. And but again, to Mom's credit, she was out of town on a business trip, and she came home, and I was sitting there miserable. And I said, I have some bad news. And she said, are the kids okay? That was her first question. And when I said, told her what happened, she said, oh, good, I thought something happened with the kids. So, I said, well, I've got 8.5 months of severance, and they're putting me in this place to try and get a new, what is it called?
Like a placement company?
Placement
Yeah.
company, yeah, and they help you with your resumes and stuff like that for 8.5 months. And, so I was still getting paid for 8.5 months, still getting benefits for 8.5 months, but I had lost my job. And, I went through a ton of interviews, and I remember it was kind of a funny thing. We would meet, the people that were there would meet every Wednesday, all the people that were looking for jobs. And they were like high-level bank employees and stuff like that. And I remember the first time I had an interview, I came back and they said, so how'd it go? I said, I really think I got it. And they all looked at each other and went, what are you looking at? They said, you're still in the honeymoon period. You're going to think every job you interview for, you got. And they were right. I would come back, I think I had a job, and then I didn't have it. But I did some consulting for good money, just a couple consulting jobs, but it was enough. I was making more than I was making at McCormick doing consulting for Hershey's chocolate. I knew a guy there. He brought me in to consult on a couple things. And for the spice company in Baltimore Spice, I consulted for them. Again, with my honesty, when he was talking about possibly hiring me, he brought in these 2 guys from Germany. They were owned by a German company, and they sat me down and they started asking me questions about McCormick. And I put my hands up like this and I said, I have to tell you. I said, I am not here to spill all of McCormick's secrets. I said, I've looked at your business and I know that I could help you grow your business, but it's not McCormick's business, and it won't be the exact same way that McCormick did it. But I'm not telling you all about them. I've got my experience, I know what to do, and I'll do it. Well, didn't get that job. But that's all they wanted. And of course, I had already been sent a letter from the legal department at McCormick saying, you're not allowed to tell anybody this, you have a non-disclosure, and blah, 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 blah. So anyway, while I was doing consulting and looking for other jobs, I get a call from this headhunter, and she said, I have a company that's interested in you. They've heard about you in the industry. Again, you don't know what's bullshit and what's not. And she said, and they really would like to talk to you. They're located in Wichita, Kansas. And I said, I'm just not doing it. I said, my wife and I are not ready to move to Wichita, Kansas. I said, I will find something in Baltimore. So, hung up, and I'm doing my thing again, trying to find jobs in Baltimore and other places. And she calls me back like a couple weeks later. Arnie, they really want to talk to you. Will you just go and talk to them? And I said, no. I said, I'm not interested in Wichita, Kansas. And it took probably 3 or 4 times when she kept calling and saying, they really want to talk to you. And I finally said, okay, She said, they're offering a lot of money, and she told me the amount. And I'm glad she didn't see my eyes open because it really was a lot. They had so much money. And so, I went, and I did tell Mom that, I'll go and interview with them. What I did when I got to the hotel the night before the interview is I called the synagogue there, and well, first I looked in the phone book to see if there were any synagogues. That was the first thing I wanted to look at. And then I called a synagogue and said, do you have any Jewish real estate agents that go to your synagogue? And they hooked me up with one. And then anyhow, I had my interview, and I could tell from the interview this time that this was real. They really did want me. And I said, I really have to think this over. And came home and talked with Mom, and they said they would fly her out, which they did. And we went around with this real estate agent, and I think she told you the story that he said, Sunday I'm having a few friends for lunch. Why don't you guys join us? And we got there, and he had it was like the whole Jewish community at this restaurant. And it was so welcoming. I mean, they were great. And eventually we decided my severance was running out. My consulting jobs had been paid, and there was nothing in Baltimore. I mean, I would have worked for cheap in Baltimore, but we couldn't find anything. So we finally said, well, that's it. And I hated it. Again, another reason I was really disappointed. She had to give up her best job. She had gotten her certification and everything else, and she had to give up her job, which was horrible. And again, I felt horrible. But at that time, I think we both knew you can feel horrible, but you have to go where the work is. But that was another thing where I learned about trust, because my boss, I started making noise that they were hearing at their corporate offices with ideas that I was having as to how we could expand the visibility of the Cargill brand, and I built plans and showed them to their head of marketing, the corporate head of marketing, and she wanted to do it, and she had me present to other people there, and the word started getting back to my boss. And I had told him I was doing all this, but I think he just thought it wouldn't amount to anything. But there was a pretty good chance at the time that they were going to promote me. We'd have been moving to Minneapolis, but it would have been corporate marketing instead of a division marketing in Wichita. But it was just ideas that I had that they were a meat company, and they couldn't get their mindset out of, I used to call them meatheads. They couldn't get their mindset out of that they're selling meat. Meat, we gotta sell meat. And I was saying that on the food service side, we're selling the center of the plate. We're selling for a restaurateur, your center of your plate. And we even came up with the promotion, the center of your plate is the center of our attention. And that's when I sent our guys, including myself, to the Culinary Institute of America. They were trained on meat and how to make meat meals and things like that. And we had a big advertising campaign where we got our graduation. It was a 1-year thing with, we were all wearing the chef's uniforms, and we were throwing them in the air, and they had a big cover story and stuff like that. And I really think that my boss at the time was starting to sweat, because he thought he was the king of the hill. And I wasn't trying to take his job. I was just coming up with ideas. But anyhow, mad cow disease hit, and he had me, I had to fire some people. And he told me, you have to talk to your people and tell them that there's a chance they're going to be fired. And they were firing people throughout, but mainly the food service division. And I had a meeting with one guy, and I told him, I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to let you go. And it was a very difficult thing, because the guy was doing his job and he was doing it well. But they had made up their mind that with mad cow, they had one cow in the United States. And they thought it was going to be like Great Britain. We weren't going to sell any meat for a couple of years, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I went up to his office afterwards, and he said, did you talk to Ray? And I said, yeah. And he said, don't you think Ray's a little bit like you, Arnie? And I said, what? He said, he has a lot of good ideas and everything, but, he's just not going to go any further than he is or anything. And he kept saying stuff like, don't you think you're a little bit like Ray? And finally, I looked at him and I said, Matt, are you firing me? And he goes, yeah, I guess I am. Like that, like he just thought about the idea. And I got up, I didn't even question it. He said, well, he did say, he said, we will move you and Helene. I said, are you kidding me? He said, Arnie, we will move you and Helene anywhere you want to go in the country. Even if you want to go back to Baltimore, we will move you back there. I got up, I walked to his door, and I turned around and I went, you should be ashamed of yourself. I said, I moved here from Baltimore for you. Then I moved to Milwaukee for you, when you promised me that I wouldn't have to. And now you're firing me after, this short period of time. And I did. I pointed at him like that. I said, you should be ashamed of yourself. So anyway, they gave me the 2 weeks notice, and I said, I'm still coming in. I did that at McCormick too. I still came in. I was not gonna walk out the door with my tail between my legs. But what I was really doing was I was gathering files. They were both too stupid to know that I was taking all the best things I did with me each night in my briefcase. I was taking it out with me. Well, anyway, I did that there, and that's when I made the call to Tropical. But before I made the call to Tropical, he came in with the HR guy, because they had to tell me everything that, I had to fill out and all this. So they went through all this stuff, and the HR guy is ready to pack up, and I said, what about the relocation? And he said, what relocation? And my boss, Matt, sat there just like this, and I said, Matt told me that he would move me and Helene anywhere in the country we wanted to move, including back home to Baltimore. And the HR guy said, we don't do that. And he looks at Matt, and Matt says, oh, Arnie, you must have misunderstood. I said, Matt, it couldn't have been any clearer. Arnie, we will move you anywhere in the country, including Baltimore. I never said that. Never happened. Just like he lied right to my face and the HR guy's face, and the guy said, we're not moving you. That's it. We're not moving you. And, you were let go, and you've got 2 weeks severance or whatever they gave me. And that's another trust thing, learning. I always trust people too much. That is, if I have a weakness at work, it's that. When they say, we're family, that's bullshit. You're not family, you're an employee, and that's the way they look at you when it comes to dollars and cents. And even with Tropical, best job I ever had. I mean, bar none. I loved what I was doing, I loved the people, loved what I was doing. I knew they had to let me go because I was the highest paid person there, and he told me that. At the same time, he could have fired the other guy. He fired me because I was higher paid. But it was like, all along, Arnie, you're my right-hand man. And I was his vice president. But in any case, I learned with Matt about trust. And the funny thing is, and I don't know if you even knew this, Mom knows it, when I went to work for, when I was working for Tropical, the head guy of that division at Cargill, he was at corporate now, and he was like a very well-known head guy, and he gives me a call, and he said, Arnie, I just found out that Matt fired you. How did that happen? And I said, you didn't know? And he said, no. And I told him, I said, Bill, I said, this is what happened. Matt called me in. I said, he says, and I said, I can handle it. I said, I'm a big boy. Things like this happen in business. I'm a big boy. And I said, what I'm more upset about is the money I think they owe me. He says, well, what kind of money? And I said, well, Matt told me he would move me anywhere in the country, and he didn't. We had to pay to move. He said, how much do you think it cost you? I said, at least $10,000. I said, I would say $10,000. He said, I'll get back to you. 15 minutes later, I had a voicemail from Matt. Arnie, hey, it's Matt. Hey, listen, we were talking about it here, and we're going to send you $10,000, like it was his idea. And, and I'm glad it was a voicemail, because if I'd have picked up, I'd have said, you son of a bitch liar. But they did. They said this guy arranged to have a check sent to me for $10,000 because he had balls or brains or whatever. He was a nice guy, and he knew he was able to put the pieces together with what was happening with me at corporate and with Matt, because he was at corporate and he saw what was happening, and he was even part of the thing I was doing with the chefs. He spoke at that graduation we had, and I had him speak and everything, but he was Matt's boss. but he wasn't gonna fire Matt at the time, but he did send me the $10,000. But again, I told you that I learned something through my career: trust. You can be good, you can trust to a point, but don't think that you can trust them to go beyond what they have to do financially, or how many people they can have, or anything like that. And that's what I have to get Mickey to learn, is he can't just walk in, and I never did ever walk in, even when I was looking, other than running into the guy at the airport. I never walked in and said, if you don't promote me, I'm gonna look elsewhere. I just didn't do that. So, anyway, that was my work history.